The mahogany-paneled office in downtown Denver fell silent as my brother's triumphant declaration echoed off the walls. I get the house and the empire. He only gets the toy soldiers. The assembled vultures, our relatives, erupted in cruel laughter, their eyes gleaming with anticipated inheritance scraps. But Notary Harrison Cross cleared his throat, his steel-gray eyes finding mine across the room on this crisp October morning in 2024. Actually, he said, his voice cutting through their mirth like a blade through silk. Mr. Kane never owned the company directly. My name is Alex Kane. At 28. I've spent the last decade working at Kane Industries while my golden boy brother Blake partied his way through business school on daddy's dime. What my family didn't know was that 3 years ago, when our company faced a major lawsuit that could have destroyed everything, Dad made a strategic decision that would change all our lives. Blake's face transformed from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to something approaching terror. What do you mean he never owned it directly? Harrison Cross, the only man in that room besides me who knew the truth, pulled out a leather portfolio thick with documents. 3 years ago, facing potential bankruptcy from the Peterson lawsuit, your father transferred Kane Industries to a family trust. Alex was named as the sole beneficiary and trustee, with your father remaining as a consultant until his death. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Aunt Sophie's champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Uncle Marcus made a sound, like air escaping from a punctured tire. And Blake looked like he'd been struck by lightning. This is impossible, he stammered, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled as he ran his hands through it. I'm the eldest. I studied business. Dad always said I'd take over. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Blake was studying business, which mostly involved fraternity parties and semester-long trips to Europe, I was the one Dad turned to when the company faced its darkest hour. The Peterson lawsuit threatened $50 million in damages. Blake was skiing in Aspen that week, posting Instagram stories while I worked 18-hour days with our lawyers. Dad did tell you that you'd take over, I said, speaking for the first time since the reading began. My voice was calm, measured. But he also told you that leadership had to be earned. You assumed it would be handed to you regardless. Blake's face flushed red. But we discussed it constantly. He said a lot of things. I interrupted. He also watched what we both did when the company was on the brink of collapse. You went skiing. I saved the business. The notary adjusted his glasses. Perhaps I should clarify the timeline. When Kane Industries faced the Peterson lawsuit in 2021, Mr. Kane Sr. consulted with both sons about the crisis. Blake suggested hiring expensive consultants and taking a defensive approach. Alex proposed the settlement strategy that ultimately saved the company $35 million and preserved all jobs. I pulled out my briefcase, something I'd brought knowing this moment might come. Dad started testing us both after that. Every major decision, every crisis. He'd present the problem to both of us separately and see how we responded. The room was dead silent now. The earlier celebration, forgotten. The Riverside Development Project in 2022. I continued, opening a folder. Zoning issues threatened to kill our biggest contract. Blake suggested we sell our stake to avoid risk. I spent 3 months in City Hall, worked with environmental lawyers, negotiated with community groups, saved the project and our reputation. I opened another folder. The union negotiations last year. Blake wanted to outsource to non-union workers to cut costs. I negotiated a deal that kept our skilled workforce and actually reduced long-term expenses by 12%. Each revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The family members who'd been laughing at my toys inheritance were now staring at Blake with growing understanding and disappointment. Every test. Every crisis. The same pattern. I said quietly. Blake looked for the easy way out. I looked for solutions that protected the company and our people. Blake's expensive suit suddenly looked wrinkled and cheap. But I have an MBA from Wharton which Dad paid for, I replied. After you barely graduated from CU Boulder with a 3 gigapascals. Your Wharton admission was secured by Dad's $2 million donation to their building fund. The notary coughed diplomatically. Your father left specific instructions about this revelation. He said, And I quote, Blake needs to understand that privilege is not the same as competence. Harrison continued reading from Dad's detailed notes. Regarding the personal inheritance, Blake receives the family estate in Aspen, valued at $4, $2 million, along with its $3, $2 million mortgage, and annual maintenance costs of approximately $180. Ling ling ling. Blake perked up momentarily. Then his face fell as the math sank in. Alex inherits what your father called the legacy collection, military figurines, model aircraft, and historical collectibles accumulated over 4 generations. Blake actually snorted with derision. Toys. At least that makes sense. Harrison's lips quirked into what might have been a smile. According to the most recent appraisal conducted by Sotheby's auction house, the collection's current market value is $12, $8 million. It includes extremely rare pieces, original 1,960 seconds G.I. Joe prototypes, limited edition military models from the 1,970 seconds, and a complete set of 1,980 seconds die-cast aircraft that were never mass-produced. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. 12 million. Your great-grandfather began collecting military models after returning from World War II. Harrison explained. Each generation added carefully selected pieces. Your father was particularly astute about their investment potential. Alex has maintained detailed provenance records and market valuations for every item, tracking auction sales and market trends. While Blake rolled his eyes at kid stuff, I'd spent years researching each piece, understanding its historical significance, monitoring auction prices. What looked like child's play to him was actually a sophisticated investment portfolio that outperformed most stocks over the past decade. Let me understand this, Blake said, his voice rising with panic. Alex gets a company worth. What exactly? Harrison consulted his documents. Kane Industries was valued at $340 million as of last month. Under Alex's management as trustee, the company's value has increased 45% over 3 years. Despite the challenging economic climate, Blake's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. This can't be legal. He manipulated Dad somehow. Dad was sick. Confused, actually. Harrison interrupted, producing another document. Your father underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months before his death. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a court-certified psychiatrist, deemed him completely mentally competent. He specifically requested this evaluation to prevent exactly this type of challenge. I stood up, straightening my tie. Blake. Dad spent the last 3 years of his life watching us both. Every conversation, every decision, every crisis was a test. You failed them all. The final blow came when Harrison produced a sealed envelope. Your father left this letter, with instructions to read it only after the inheritance details were revealed. He handed it to me. Dad's distinctive handwriting read, "To be opened when Blake finally understands." I broke the wax seal and read aloud. To my son Alex, who proved that leadership is about service, not privilege. You earned every responsibility through dedication and wisdom. To Blake, who confused entitlement with inheritance. You had every advantage: education, connections, opportunities, but you never understood that respect must be earned through character and competence. Perhaps losing everything you expected will teach you the value of everything you took for granted. The company is safe in Alex's hands, as I always knew it would be. The silence stretched until Blake finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What am I supposed to do now? I looked at my brother, this man who'd lived his entire life expecting everything to be handed to him, who'd spent years dismissing my contributions while taking credit for my successes when it suited him. Now, I said, gathering my documents, you learn what I learned a long time ago, that success is built one honest day's work at a time. Dad gave you the same opportunities he gave me. What you did with them was your choice. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh. And Blake Kane Industries has a new policy. All executive positions require 5 years of proven industry experience. You're welcome to apply for an entry-level position like everyone else. The aftermath unfolded over the following months, with predictable precision. Blake's reputation in Denver's business circles crumbled when word spread about the inheritance reversal. The networking contacts who'd courted him as the future Kane Industries heir suddenly stopped returning his calls. The Aspen estate became a financial anchor. Blake discovered that owning a $4, $2 million property with a $3, $2 million mortgage and six-figure annual expenses required actual income to sustain. Within 4 months, he was forced to list the property for sale, ultimately accepting a loss due to the urgent timeline. His job search proved equally humbling. Construction firms throughout Colorado knew the Kane family story. Interviews were polite but brief. "We'll be in touch" became a familiar refrain that never materialized into offers. Meanwhile, I moved into Dad's executive suite now, officially mine in Kane Industries' downtown Denver headquarters. The nameplate reading, Alex Kane, CEO and President, represented not just a title change, but the culmination of years of preparation I hadn't fully realized were happening. Blake eventually found work as a junior project coordinator at a mid-sized development firm in Colorado Springs, earning $48,000 annually, less than his old monthly allowance from Dad. He rented a one-bedroom apartment in a complex I'd probably inspected for code compliance at some point, and watched from a distance as Kane Industries expanded under my leadership. 6 months after the reading, as I signed contracts for our most ambitious project, yet a sustainable housing development that would revolutionize affordable construction in the Denver metro area, I reflected on how Blake's years of condescension had inadvertently prepared me for this moment. His constant dismissal had forced me to document every success, prove every point, build an unshakable foundation of competence. His arrogance had taught me humility. His assumption that leadership was his birthright had shown me that true leadership must be earned daily. The military collectibles in my office, now displayed in custom cases with museum-quality lighting, serve as daily reminders that value isn't always obvious. Success isn't always loud, and the quiet ones often get the last laugh. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply letting people discover that the person they underestimated was in control all along. Story 2. When I refused to remove those shameful, silly medals from my dad, a wealthy CEO, he slapped me in front of 280 guests. My fiancée, a 4-star Navy SEAL, then grabbed his wrist and said 8 words, causing the entire room to stand up. The CEO's face turned white, and the sound of his slap was so loud that it sounded like a pistol shot. And 280 guests froze in the middle of a champagne fork hanging above prime rib plates, their eyes darting between us in shock. I didn't flinch even though my cheek was stinging, the rows of ribbons clinking faintly against one another, as if to remind me why I stood tall in the first place. Caused my medal to shift slightly with the impact. My own father, the chairman of Holstead Enterprises, performed my wedding in front of everyone, not out of private rage but out of public humiliation. A man who had created a tech empire from the ground up and never let anyone forget it had just hit his daughter. Expensive whiskey and polished wood roses filled the hall. All I could feel, though, was the weight of 280 pairs of eyes and the burn on my face. His voice was dripping with contempt, and he had already sneered his command once. He said that the service ribbons on my chest were cheap costume jewelry and a disgrace to his reputation. So take off those stupid medals. His hand slashed out after I had declined with a silent headshake and chin-high posture that had been ingrained in my bones from years of standing inspection. Another hand, steady, powerful, and gloved in white, caught him before I could react. James, my fiancé and a 4-star Navy SEAL, had intervened. Calm but uncompromising, he held my father's wrist with iron control and leaned in close enough that only a handful of people in the front rows could hear. He uttered 8 low, purposeful words. Whatever strength Dad believed he possessed vanished. Everyone in the room stood up. There was no mayhem. It was a group decision. A silent verdict. A wave of movement. The CEO, who had relied on commanding attention to build his empire, suddenly appeared insignificant. His eyes darted like a man in a corner. His face drained of color. Even though my cheeks were still burning, I remained proud. I straightened up, because I was more than just a daughter at that moment. I was an officer with distinction, a woman who had borne her burden on decks and in deserts all over the world. I'm sure you're wondering how we got here. What makes a father slap his daughter on her wedding day? Why such rage could be sparked by the one truth I had ever owned a uniform? You must understand my origins, in order to comprehend that moment in the hallway. Love was rationed out like quarterly dividends in the home where I grew up. And power was valued like money. Dad was the type of man who judged his value by his ability to impress people at the country club and by profit margins and dinner conversations. He drove cars that were more expensive than some families' homes, smoked cigars that smelled like burned leather, and wore armor-like custom suits. He appeared to be bigger than life to the outside world. He seemed like an insurmountable wall to me. He had a mental map of my journey from the moment I could walk. Prep, Ivy League, a position on the board, and, eventually, Holstead Enterprises corner office. He didn't bring up kids. He raised descendants. That's what he believed he was doing. Anyway, I never quite fit into his blueprint. Though, even as a child, I was the one smuggling military history library books under the covers at night while my brothers played golf and worked on balance sheets. When Dad would start talking about mergers and market trends at the dinner table, I would find myself looking out the window at the flag, flapping in the evening wind, and imagining what it would be like to be eligible to salute it. At one point, Dad saw me ironing his old ROC uniform that had been stuffed in a closet. His laughter was not kind. Spend less time on those things. CEOs give orders. Soldiers follow them. In one word, that was his philosophy. Early on, I discovered that in his world, service came before prestige and medals, and uniforms came before suits. Medals, well, were dumb. I wore mine to my wedding, but why I knew exactly how he would react. So why did I defy him? Because there was more to the medals than just ribbon and medal. My life's narrative revolved around them. They were all sweat scars, sleepless nights. In the midst of chaos, decisions were made. They were not decorations. They served as evidence. I earned them in seas that tossed ships like toy boats. In deserts where the sun peeled skin from bone, I earned them in silence. 2. On nights when the only sounds were the soft crackle of a radio and the silent prayers of the men at my side. Unanswered letters, missed calls, and accomplishments, without a father's cheers. Ironically, those medals were worth more than any stock certificate that Dad had ever signed. History weighed heavily on them. It wasn't just for show. They were necessary for survival. Dad hit me. And it wasn't just a slap. I experienced the result of decades of rejection. The epitome of every scoff, every silence. And every time he looked at me, he saw a failure to follow his script rather than a daughter or an officer. However, the room did not support him. Not now. Investors, family members, strangers, and guest CEOs all stood up, not in cheers, but in silent solidarity, and I could feel the eyes of the people who were most important among the sea of designer gowns and fitted suits. I had bled with the SEALs, my brothers in arms. Their eyes blazed with pride rather than sympathy. Commanding rooms had always been the foundation of Dad's empire. But with 8 words from a SEAL, authority changed in that hall, and 280 people stood up against conceit. The power dynamic shifted, but my cheek continued to sting. However, something else did as well. Clarity. I came to see that I could validate my path without Dad's approval. My life. Me vows. My medals. He didn't have authority over them. That moment, however, wasn't unexpected. A childhood of dominance, a young adulthood of disobedience, and a career carved in places Dad never cared to look had all contributed to its years-long brewing. You must know where it all started, if you want to comprehend the significance of that slap and why the room stood for me rather than him. It started even before I wore a uniform. Rich, but not warm, was my birthplace. Our home, a glass and stone monument to success with leather chairs, oil paintings, and quiet. was perched high on a hill outside of Boston. The drive from the front gate to the door always felt longer because you knew what was waiting inside. Even though the driveway was long enough to accommodate a dozen cars, Holstead Enterprises founder and CEO, Father Richard Holstead, viewed the family as employees and the home as a boardroom. He valued efficiency, order, and discipline over affection. His everyday attire consisted of a fitted gray suit with a tie knot and military-skilled shoes that were so immaculate you could see your reflection in them. Every evening, he would arrive at the front door like a general coming home from a campaign, tossing his keys on the marble table and anticipating dinner at precisely 630. We were not related. We had a schedule. My brothers, 2 older and 1 younger, were raised to be the empire's heirs. As if a putter and a portfolio were all a man needed to live. Dad took them to the club every Saturday morning to teach them golf swings and market trends. He discussed legacy, leverage, and investments with them. He discussed appearances with me, his only daughter. He repeatedly said, "You'll be judged by who you marry, not by what you do. Therefore, don't make the family feel embarrassed. Keep your chin up and smile when someone speaks to you." I was like a piece on a chessboard to him, a prospective bride who is intended to forge alliances rather than pursue personal goals. My mom was the gentle counterbalance. She cherished quiet times that escaped Dad's structured life. As well as books and art, she soothed the cold edge of the house with her voice as she read me poetry before bed. She kissed my knee after I scraped it. She whispered to me when I was doubting myself, "Don't let anyone decide your worth. Not even your father." However, her soft voice was frequently overpowered by my father's orders. The topic of conversation at dinner shifted from family to stock tickers. At the table, my brothers presented fictitious business plans and received praise for their strong economics grades. In the meantime, I would discuss my interest in the Navy or my history projects on the Revolutionary War, and Dad would wave dismissively, interrupting me. He would say that those incapable of making fortunes fight wars. You're not that. You're more intelligent than that. Or you might be. Anyway, it was more than merely disapproval. It was contempt. I have a clear memory of one night, sitting at the long oak table beneath the chandelier. I was 12 years old. I was proud to display my A in civics on my recently received report card. I told Dad that I wanted to participate in the school's junior ROC program. I hoped that my initiative and discipline would impress him. Not even his eyes left his stake. He marched around in cheap uniforms and said it was ridiculous. Refuses to place food on the table. But I got started. That, it's about leadership and service. His knife clattered against porcelain as he slammed it down on silver. The room became silent. Forget about wasting your breath. There's no program that teaches you how to salute. We salute whole studs. We don't honor other people. With my eyes on my plate and my cheeks burning, I sat there, half amused, half relieved. My brothers grinned. They were not in the line of fire, squeezing my hand. My mother reached under the table. It was the only solace I received. As I lay awake that night, I made the decision to remember every word, not as a means of restraint, but as motivation to disprove him. The distance between us had grown by high school. My brothers were exact replicas of him, walking down corridors in dapper blazers and discussing hedge funds and initial public offerings. The odd one out. I was drawn to the ROC students as they practiced drills, their boots scuffing the pavement in a precise rhythm on the football field. My father acted as though I had announced my intention to join the circus when I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. All of your advantages are being thrown away. He let out a bark. When people hear that my daughters are crawling through mud rather than conducting board meetings, do you know what they will say? They'll make fun of me and you? With a shaky but steady voice, I answered, I don't care what they say. I made this decision. After giving me a long look, he said, the words that would stick in my head for years. Don't count on me to walk with you if you choose that route. He meant it. Too. I wasn't discouraged. Though, I studied academy applications, committed rules to memory, and ran long before dawn in the middle of the night. When Dad wasn't there, my mother quietly assisted me by giving me study aids and pamphlets. She was aware that I had to escape the gilded cage. I rushed into the living room with my heart racing and my hands shaking the day my acceptance letter from Annapolis arrived. Mom burst into tears of happiness. Dad didn't. After 30 seconds of staring at the envelope, he muttered, "So, you're serious about this nonsense," and left the room. I didn't hear from him for 2 months. I had never experienced silence as punishment before, and it hurt more than yelling ever could. When I think back on it, I see that Dad didn't have to raise his voice. His expectations hung in the air like smoke, and he ruled with presence. You were either expelled or you lived up to them. I was already on the verge of being expelled. Even though it was painful, I learned something valuable from that house. Without empathy, power is meaningless. Dad had a huge empire. His impact is indisputable. His family, however, lived in fear rather than love. And I secretly knew I didn't want that legacy. I wanted to construct something unique. A life rooted in honor, not a business or a fortune. I didn't hesitate when the academy accepted me because of this. It was 5 in the morning when I packed my things, bid my mother farewell, and left the marble floors and chandeliers behind to enter a world of steel bunks. Dad referred to drills and uniforms as silly. I had never made a decision as difficult as this one. However, it was also the beginning of the journey to the aisle. One day, with 280 people watching, my dad scowling, and medals shining, I would walk as our worlds finally collided. The house felt colder than ever the summer before I left for Annapolis. The air conditioner wasn't the cause. It was the quiet. Dad hardly gave me a look. He had read the Wall Street Journal at breakfast as if I didn't exist. He asked my brothers about market trends and internships during dinner, but he never once looked at me. I appeared to have already been removed from the entire Stud family portrait. I heard him talking on the phone in his study one evening. The heavy oak door echoed with his voice. His words, "She's throwing her life away. It's no better than flipping hamburgers to join the Navy. She won't be around for a year." The words struck me more forcefully than if he had yelled them directly at me. I clenched my fists and stood in the hallway, learning every word by heart. Dad did it that way. He dismissed without arguing, and he strengthened my resolve by dismissing me. He said that Annapolis was everything. It would be hard, relentless, and ruthless. However, he was unaware of and never comprehended the fact that I flourished under duress. Running until my lungs burned during the first few weeks almost broke me up before dawn. I did push-ups until my arms started to shake. A single crease in your uniform could result in hours of additional drills during an inspection. I recall hearing an instructor yell in my face as I stood in formation, perspiration streaming down my back. "Do you think you can get through this with your father's money? Rethink your thought?" I wanted to shout that I had left all of that behind, but I refrained from doing so. I simply clenched my jaw and waited. Every taunt and disciplinary action served as fuel. On some nights, I screamed and fell into bed, questioning whether my father was correct and whether I wasn't suited for this. However, I could imagine him grinning while sipping his scotch and telling his coworkers that his daughter had failed, and I became enraged at the thought. There was no room for failure. I began to settle into a routine by my sophomore year. I put more effort into my studies than I had ever done before. I stayed in the library learning strategy, logistics, and history, while others went out to drink. My legs felt like steel after running. I got up slowly. I refused to give up. Not because I was the strongest. My first promotion ceremony is something I will always remember. I felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on me for the first time when my commanding officer pinned my new bar. After that, I called home in a proud voice. The line continued to ring. I mailed a picture of the ceremony since I got no response. I only received one envelope back after several weeks. There was no congratulations in it. It was a snippet of an article about my brother's Goldman Sachs internship from a business magazine. In his handwriting, a yellow sticky note read, "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half. The divide only widened. My world was about service and sacrifice, while my father's was about profits and prestige. Every holiday homecoming became another battleground. He would sit at the head of the table, swirling bourbon, and ask, "So, still playing soldier?" "It's not playing." I would respond. He would retort, Milk doesn't pay mortgages. Mom would step in, saying calmly but firmly, not everything has to be about money. Richard, he would scoff, withdraw into silence, and I would leave the table no longer hungry. In reality, though, I had discovered a new kind of family, one that was forged in fire rather than blood, and my classmates became brothers and sisters. Graduation was bittersweet. I stood with my dress white's cap tucked under my arm as the band played and the crowd cheered. We persevered together, sweated together, and helped each other up when we fell. There was no stock options or boardroom hierarchy, just the mission and whether you could be trusted to carry it out. As proud families waved flags and took pictures, I looked around the stand for a face I knew I wouldn't see. Dad hadn't come, not for the commissioning, not for the ceremony, not for this moment, but Mom was there, wiping tears from her eyes as his daughter became an official officer in the U.S. Navy. Deployment came swiftly after, and my first assignment was Okinawa, far from the glittering skyscrapers Dad loved to point to as symbols of power. She hugged me so tightly afterward that I could hardly breathe. "He's wrong about you," she whispered. "You've already proven more than he ever has." Her words stuck with me long after she was gone. The work wasn't glamorous. The days were long. And the nights were long. Supply chains, logistics, and a ton of paperwork to keep things running were all important. I had to answer to men twice my size. And I learned how to project authority clearly rather than loudly. When I led a unit in the field for the first time, my nerves almost killed me. Years went by, and I gathered not wealth but ribbons, each one a testament to survival, to perseverance, to moments Dad would never comprehend. When I pulled a wounded comrade across a field of fire, when I bandaged him under the din of gunfire, when I refused the stretcher despite shrapnel in my side. Those weren't just acts of duty. They were acts of defiance against the man who had repeatedly told me I wasn't enough, said I couldn't. And I felt the gap between us widen with each scar and metal pin to my chest. He had his empire of steel and glass, and I had my empire of loyalty and grit. He never called or came to visit, and he never once expressed pride. But I also stopped needing him. Combat is never portrayed in movies as having soaring music and clear distinctions between bravery and fear. Instead, it feels like 1,000 snap decisions, some of which you remember forever, and others of which you only realize later saved a life. This is because by that time, I had created something stronger than his approval. I had created myself. We were running a joint exercise that turned into a real-world scramble when Intel moved a friendly convoy too far off a safe route, and the desert decided to swallow our plans whole. I learned this the hard way on a night when the sky over the Gulf looked like oil and the radio sounded like a heartbeat skipping out of rhythm. When a truck's axle broke and its driver stopped talking on the radio, I was the one closest to the authority to move. So I did so without asking permission. I was the one the clipboard adored, the one with maps and manifests, and the unglamorous job of keeping every line humming. The driver was pinned under the dash, conscious bleeding, trying to apologize for inconveniencing us. People apologize a lot when they're dying. Part of the strange politeness war beats into you. I can still remember the heat coming through the soles of my boots as if the ground had teeth. A medic, and I slid behind the disabled vehicle, and I felt the world shrink to a small circle of dust and pain. When the dust settled and the helicopter roared in, I realized my hands were shaking and put them behind my back so no one could see. Then, I walked out in front of my team with steady steps because steadiness is a language leaders must speak even when their mouths are closed. We used a borrowed pry bar to free him, the kind of tool for which no one writes citations. There was no one to call. So I didn't call home to tell anyone. Word spreads in the quiet sideways way it does. During off-peak hours, a SEAL detachment that had observed us at work began to show up at our range. At first, I thought they were making fun of me, the courteous nods you give an officer who isn't one of you, but they kept returning. Not to test me, but to train with me. We found a rhythm around the rack of rusty kettlebells and the rusted pull-up bars. And even though they were older than me on average, scarred in the ways the body records, and reserved in the ways pain demands, I learned to keep quiet when they told stories, and to ask exactly one question when they were done. I learned that respect is a two-lane road without a shoulder. There was Hill, who called me ma'am, with a smile on the corner of his mouth, as if the word meant the difference between chaos and order. Riley, whose voice never rose above a calm murmur, no matter how loud the world got. And Torres, who had run on a prosthetic. Like the ground owed him time. It had stolen. We began blending operations practice before real, and I brought structure to places that preferred mystery. I didn't earn their friendship with speeches. I earned it by showing up again, showing up when it hurt, when it rained, and when it would have been easier to send an email. Ma'am, plans are pretty until they meet the tide. Trust the tide. Hill's voice appeared over the calm's light as a hand on your shoulder. Once on a night op near a coastline that smelled like rust and grief. My timeline ran red. The timet said 5 minutes to extraction. But the clock said we'd used 8. He passed me a thermos and said, "You kept us from sprinting into a wall that counts." I wanted to say that his composure saved us, but instead I nodded once. The way you do, when you realize that a pact doesn't require ink. We adjusted, and we came out wet, late, and alive. After that season, I wore new ribbons, the kind that catch your breath more than the light, and I mailed my mother a picture because I couldn't stop. Even though I knew her home felt more like a museum than a home. I received a little card back in her looping script that read, "I'm proud of you. And I always have been. Be gentle with those who won't say it out loud." A month later, I received a call from my father, not to me, but to my CEO's office, and I read it 3 times before putting it in the back of my wallet behind my military ID like an amulet. Bureaucracy can be cruel to the personal, and by the time I received the message, it was already old. Your mother is in hospice. If I could take a leave of absence. There was a window. She looked smaller in bed. Her hair gone. Her hands cool and papery in mine. And my father stood at the corner of the room like a piece of dark furniture. His face composed. His tie still perfect. The kind of window life often closes while you're filling out the form to request it. I flew home anyhow, landing in a city that felt like an old suit that no longer fit. And the house smelled of money and lemon polish. She woke up and spoke in a whisper that went straight to my bones. "You look so strong," she said. "Are you strong?" We didn't argue. We didn't talk. We just watched the machine write its thin line of beeps like a final memo. She smiled softly at the edges, the way people smile when they paint. I told her I was because I had to be day. I didn't hear from my father again after the funeral, but he never reached for me. And I signed paperwork the way I signed orders, and flew back into a world where grief is something you fold and tuck into your pocket so your hands are free. Keep choosing what's true, even when it's not applauded. She slept, and hours later, she was gone as gently as she had lived. I had been assigned to oversee a training rotation, and the SEALs had just returned from something none of them could talk about. But all of them carried in their shoulders. Riley was limping, and he had a bruise high on his cheekbone that looked like a map of somewhere unkind. Months passed without a note or a call, and the next time the past collided with the present, it was on a pier that smelled like salt and diesel. It's odd, which moments you remember with verbs and which you remember with color. That evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon like a coin, James walked down the pier. We didn't ask. We lifted and breathed as a group until the air felt friendly again. We'd met at briefings and collided on paper sync timelines more than once. But this was not a meeting or a timeline. And he held a small box as if it weighed more than it actually did. I can't promise you calm seas. I remember the light bruised purple, then gold. The scrape of his boots, and him stopping just shy of my space respectfully without saying a word. I said yes because I knew he knew the difference between decoration and proof. He had seen me at Colmea. My hairpin-back uniform creased with pride and exhaustion. Choosing people over appearance. He loved that person. He didn't ask me to be quieter, softer, or less. Instead, he asked if he could stand beside the life I had built. He said, "I can promise to row with you." I wrote a card to my father out of completion. Not hope I'm getting married. 300 hours Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform. I sealed it before I could add anything I would regret. We planned a small reception, a light chapel, and an invitation list of people who had earned entry by having a stake in our story. I rewrote a training module to allow instructors to pause evolution when the distinction between damage and grit became blurry. And I stood in front of flight plans and whiteboards. Then, in front of people whose eyes told me everything I needed to know about the weight they were carrying, nobody gave me a medal for that. Instead, they gave me something better: compliance without complaint. The last operation before my wedding wasn't spectacular. It was the kind that garners a footnote in the field of saving lives and extraction, which takes more patience than bravado. The numbers changed: fewer injuries, fewer quiet collapses, and barracks at row 300. After a week out, I ironed my dress whites with the same care that I would give a map that would guide us safely, or not 4 stars. Ribbons aligned. Shoes like mirrors and pondered vows. Not the fid kind. The practical kind. Serve each other's peace. Protect each other's purpose. And refuse to dim the light that brought us here. Be gentle with those who won't say it aloud. I wondered if gentleness would ever have a place with my father. I suspected the answer was no. But I left the question open like a window in spring. The morning of the ceremony. The base was a hush of preparation. I put my mother's card on the dresser and read it again. As I walked toward the door, my phone buzzed. A number I knew by muscle memory. I didn't open it. Not yet. The day would have enough weather. I pocketed the device and reached for the handle, prepared to walk the thin line between past and future in boots that had learned both terrains. Torres texted formation outside the chapel. You walk. We stand. I replied with a single copy of the phrase, which says more than any sentiment. James wasn't the type of man who needed to fill silence. Instead, he let it sit unbothered until it went from awkward to comfortable. That's how I knew he was different from the men I'd grown up around. I didn't realize then how small a room can make a powerful man, and how big a silence can sound when 280 people decide together what they won't tolerate. James, who we met at the Pentagon during a joint working group. He was already a 4-star Navy SEAL by then. But you wouldn't know it unless someone told you. My father and brothers filled every available space with noise. Stock prices, predictions, instructions, and corrections. James filled every available space with gifts. He listened without blinking arms. His eyes folded sharply. And when the session ended, he stopped me in the hallway. You don't just move supplies, he said. You move lives. It was the kind of comment that sticks not because it flatters, but because it sees I was presenting on logistics reform, a dry subject that could put anyone to sleep. And he listened without blinking arms. His eyes folded sharply. Our first date was nothing worth a movie reel. Just a diner off base. But every time he recalled little details like how I took my coffee, how I tucked my hair under my cover, and how I stayed late not because I had to, but because something was unfinished. Not at me. He never once asked me to be less. Briefings. Field exercises. The kind of never-ending carousel that keeps the military machine turning. He didn't compete with me or measure his value against mine. And over time, his steadiness became my ballast. 2 plates of eggs and bacon. A waitress who called everyone honey. But I remember thinking, this is what normal feels like. There was no agenda. No spotlight. Just 2 people who had both seen enough darkness to appreciate the light of everyday things. He asked questions out of respect rather than curiosity. And when I returned home late, still smelling of diesel and gun oil, he would look up from his book and smile as if I had been gone 5 minutes. Not 5 days. What does it feel like to be saluted by a unit? How do you keep men composed under fire? He would shake his head and respond. No. It feels like trust. I would shrug and add, it just feels like duty. Don't downplay it. The man himself was as simple as the proposal. Just the 2 of us on a weathered pier, wearing Norfolk boots, dangling over the water goals, sobbing overhead. No elaborate gestures. No stage spectacle. He said, let me serve beside you. Wherever that means. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I just said yes. He held out a small, plain box, because I already knew. My father's response to our engagement announcement was silence rather than a call or letter. When I eventually ran into him at a family get-together a few weeks later, he cornered me close to the bar. In the dim light, his bourbon glass gleamed. Flatly, "You'll wear a proper dress," he said. "Not that costume. Not in front of my friends. You won't embarrass me. I'm not marrying you." I responded. His jaw tensed as he said, "I'm marrying him, and I'll wear what tells the truth." He turned away, muttering into his glass. But I knew the battle lines were drawn. The wedding planning was straightforward by design. Neither James nor I wanted a circus. We decided on the Naval Chapel clean line. Stained glass that caught the morning sun, pews worn by years of hands and prayers. "Do you understand how humiliating this is?" people will whisper. "They'll laugh at you." "Then let them laugh," I said. "At least I'll know I'm not lying." The seals, of course, heard about it. I never formally invited them, but they told me one by one, "We'll be there," Torres said, smiling, tapping the floor with his prosthetic leg. "You walked us through hell." The guest list was small, consisting of close friends, comrades, and a few family members I still spoke to. "We won't let you go to that altar by yourself." I made an effort to argue. They gave a headshake. "I'm getting married this Saturday." Yee. 300 hours, Naval Chapel. "I'll be in uniform." I wrote a brief card to my father a week prior to the ceremony. Not out of hope. Hope had long since been wrung out of me, but out of completeness. James stayed with a close friend the night before the wedding, and I stayed in base quarters. I sealed it before I could doubt myself. At midnight, I ironed my uniform, the only truth I had ever worn, making sure that every ribbon lined up with every button. As I smoothed the cuffs, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from a number I knew by heart but had never saved. 5 words. "You'll regret this tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not in shock, but in clarity, because this was exactly who he was and exactly who I wasn't. My polished shoes reflected the ceiling lights like pools of water. My stomach was steady. I'd faced mortars and machine guns. So what was one more confrontation with a man who had never believed in me? Outside the chapel, my team was gathered in formation medals, shining back straight. I put the phone face down, pressed one last crease into the white fabric, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, I walk as myself." The chapel smelled faintly of cedar and polish when I walked in that morning, and some of them I hadn't seen in years. All of them arrived without being asked. "Ready?" Hill asked quietly, and I nodded. Ready? I didn't realize how quickly the day would tilt. How a father's need for control would boil over into a moment that would silence 280 guests and leave him pale as stone. It was quiet, almost reverent, as if the room knew the weight of what was about to happen. 280 seats had been reserved, each one occupied by someone who represented a piece of my divided world. My heels pounded the stone floor with a rhythm that steadied me more than any prayer could. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, splintering into shards of red and gold across the pews. They were my father's crowd, gathered less to celebrate me than to judge the optics. On the other side were uniforms. SEALs, Marines, sailor, men I had trained, bled with buried friends alongside. On the one side were CEOs, investors, men and women in tailored suits, their smiles sharpened by years of boardrooms and balance sheets. They weren't there for appearances, they were there for me. There was a chasm wider than any aisle between those two groups, and I stood at the back of the chapel with Hill and Torres on either side of me, each in their own uniform. Torres leaning lightly on his prosthetic, his face composed but unwavering. Hill adjusting his cuffs, then giving me a slight smirk. I gave him a small smile and he said, "You look like a commander about to take the field." It feels about the same. The difference is, Torres continued, that we're walking with you this time. I was steadied by their presence. When they saw me, guests whispered. I didn't need them to, but it mattered anyway. The uniform was unavoidable. My chest was lined with rows of ribbons, each representing a chapter of sacrifice. The 4 stars on my shoulders appeared to be more brilliant in the sunlight than the diamonds on half the women's wrists. My father's eyes pierced the air from the front row. He looked like power incarnate. At least until you noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his hand gripped his cane just a little too tightly. He was the only man in the chapel who didn't whisper. Shift. Or blink. His tuxedo was blacker than midnight, and his tie nodded with the precision of a man who couldn't afford mistakes. My chest tightened, but not from nervousness. As the music started softly, with an organ playing the processional notes, rising, like a tide rolling in, from clarity. Every step down the aisle felt less like a bride's walk and more like a march into the truth. The seals had warned me, and I believed them. He raised one eyebrow when we met, as if to say, "Don't test me." They were not men of empty threats. I saw James at the altar halfway down the aisle. He was dressed in a simple, grounded navy blue suit, and his eyes glistened when he saw me. Not with surprise that I had worn the uniform, but with something deeper respect. I felt like I belonged. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was coming together. But the storm had already broken before I could get to him. A murmur echoed through the room. The organ faltered, the notes cutting off like a breath held too long. And Dad got up from his seat in the front row. His slow, deliberate movement was meant to catch everyone's attention. He stepped into the aisle, making me stop short. Then he said it, loud enough for the whole chapel to hear. "Take off those silly medals." The words fell into the silence, like stones into still water, and the crowd stiffened. I heard someone in the back gasp. He looked me up and down his lips, curling into a sneer that carried more disdain than words ever could. I straightened my back and met his gaze without flinching. "No," I said simply. The world held its breath for a beat before his hand exploded out. The slap came faster than I had anticipated. A crack that reverberated off the stained glass. My cheek burned. My head snapped to the side. But my footing never wavered. My throat tightened. Not with shame, but with the weight of every year that had brought me to this point. There were gasps. A glass broke somewhere near the back, and the room froze for a moment in shock. James moved before I could react, his hand locking around my father's wrist without protest. My father, the man who had made his living by controlling boardrooms and swaying crowds to his will, stood pale and trembling in front of 280 witnesses. He was calm, steady, and deliberate the way only a man who had faced down worse storms could be. He leaned in, his voice low, but sharp enough to cut 8 words that silenced the room. The entire chapel stood up, not in shock, not in chaos, but in solidarity. The chapel was completely silent for a moment. But then I realized that the aisle wasn't just a way to marriage, but the battlefield where my father's world and mine finally collided. And he was losing. And for the first time, the empire he'd built meant nothing. I didn't turn away, and my cheek still hurt. But my pride was higher than it had ever been. The silk cuff of my father's tuxedo crumpled in the iron grip of a man who had led warriors through fire. And his face, which was usually flushed with power, turned white as his hand hung, suspended in James's place. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words. Simple. Undeniable. Lethal in their truth. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of 4 stars and the authority of every man in that room who understood what it meant to serve. His eyes shifted from me, standing tall in my uniform, to James, whose serene voice had just delivered the words that would follow my father for the rest of his life. My father tried to speak, his mouth opening like a man about to launch into a boardroom tirade. But no words came. The silence was broken by the sound of 280 people rising as one. Suits, gowns, uniforms all on their feet, without any instructions or questions. This wasn't a conference table. This was a chapel full of people who measured worth not in dollars, but in sacrifice. James released his wrist with deliberate care, as though letting go of something fragile or something already broken. Dad stumbled back half a step, rubbing the place where he'd been held. Throughout his life, he had used money and intimidation to control narratives and silence dissent. My cheeks were still throbbing from the slap. But the pain was no longer significant. It had turned into fuel. I turned to face the crowd. Ribbons, glinting metals, catching the broken sunlight pouring through stained glass. And for the first time in my life, my father was on trial. Not me. The verdict was clear. The imprint of humility was deeper than any bruise could reveal. The air was heavy with reverence. The kind you don't fake. The kind that can't be purchased. One of the seals, Torres, who was leaning on his prosthetic, broke the silence with 3 words that rang louder than the organ ever could. Admiral on deck. The room instantly responded, and every military man and woman snapped to attention, saluting with crisp precision. Even some of the civilians followed suit. Awkward but sincere. This had never once been inspired by my father's empire. I looked at him, then looked closely. The man who had snubbed my dreams, interrupted me in conversations, and silenced me with contempt, had believed that today would be his big day to flaunt his wealth, power, and well-cultivated image. I walked the rest of the aisle, each step echoing like a drum beatat of defiance. While James waited at the altar, his eyes written with steady pride. Instead, he was pale, trembling, diminished under the gaze of people he could never control. He had always told me medals were silly, but in that moment, that was the only truth that mattered. The ceremony resumed, but nothing felt insignificant. Every vow, every word carried the weight of what had just happened. Hill and Torres stepped back with crisp dignity as I arrived at him. Their escort complete, the chaplain cleared his throat, his voice shaky at first, then firm. Shall we continue? I nodded once. The sting on my cheek subsided as James took my hands and vowed to serve not only my body but also my peace. At the reception that followed, there were standing ovations and whispers that swept through the crowd like wind through tall grass. But nobody dared to laugh or downplay what had transpired. James and I slipped outside for air later that night. The moonlight soft and silver as it pulled across the water. My father had left quietly before the cake was cut. No grand exit. No parting speech. Just a man slipping into the night, stripped of the authority he once thought was unbreakable. I didn't chase him because I didn't need to, because the truth had already been spoken, witnessed, and sealed. His thumb lightly touched the faint red mark on my cheek. Is it painful? That's the thing about revenge. People think it's about destruction, about crushing those who wronged you. No more. I shook my head. Good. He smiled. Because what people remember isn't the slap, but how you stood. And he was right. My father will always be a wealthy CEO. That is his legacy. But mine is different. It is honor earned in deserts and seas, carried in scars and ribbons, saluted by men who never once asked me to be less. The most powerful retaliation, however, is not loud or violent. Rather, it is standing so tall that those who attempted to break you can no longer look down. And when the world rose that day, it wasn't just my wedding, it was my reckoning. If you've ever been undervalued, rejected, or told you're not good enough, keep in mind that this honor comes from what you've endured, what you've built, and the truth you refuse to take away, regardless of who demands it. It comes from those who stood up for you when others didn't, who saluted you because they wanted to, not because they had to. And as this story slowly fades into the back of your mind, disappearing into the quiet places where mystery and memory meet, realize that it was never merely a story, but rather an awakening, a raw pulse of human truth encased in veiled emotions and whispered secrets, each word a fragment of broken reality. Every sentence serves as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, between the light of revelation and the shadowy depths of what is left unsaid. Stories work their most powerful magic in this liminal space, igniting the deepest recesses of your soul, arousing the hidden desires, the unsaid fears, and the brittle hopes that hold onto your heart. And now that secret, that trembling echo of someone else's reality, becomes part of your own shadowed narrative, intertwining with your thoughts. awakening that undeniable curiosity, that insatiable hunger to know what lies beyond. This is the power of these stories. These digital confessions, whispered into the void, like fragile embers, where anonymity becomes the mask for truth, and every viewer becomes the keeper of secrets too heavy to carry alone. Hold on to this feeling, this electric thread of wonder and unease, because it is what ties us all together across the vast, unseen web of human experience. And if your heart races, if your mind lingers on the what-ifs and the may, then you know that the story has done its work, that its magic has woven itself into the fabric of your being. What mysteries lie just out of reach, waiting for you to unravel them. Every story you read here is a whispered call to search further, to listen more intently, to embrace both the light and the dark. If you were lost or found yourself changed in any way, remember this connection by sustaining the flame. If the story haunted you, like this video, subscribe to join the community of seekers who seek the invisible truths. Here, we don't just tell stories, we call forth the forgotten, the hidden, and the unsaid. So ring the bell to be the first to welcome the next confession, the next shadow, or the next revelation that is waiting to emerge from the depths. Additionally, you, dear listener, have joined this sacred ritual. Therefore, until the next story finds you in the quiet hours, keep your senses keen, your heart open, and never stop pursuing the whispers in the silence. Thank you for watching. Be careful. Good luck. After hearing today's story, you may have some new questions or memories that you would like to revisit. These moments remind us that we are all human, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, and always learning something new. Every day on Reddit, new experiences and moments create fresh stories that connect us all. Everyone has a different life journey, and we all attempt to understand the world in our own way. If you like this story, please feel free to share it with your friends. Every story has its own unique angle, and our goal is to understand everyone's perspective and make our content diverse and relatable. Stories like these help us realize that life's journey is different for everyone. And by hearing other stories, we learn something new. We always value your thoughts and feedback because it inspires us to create even better content. You can share your own stories with us. Additionally, we value your experiences. If you liked this video, please leave a comment. We want to consistently produce content that makes you think and give you new ideas. Even if you have already seen this video, your comments are still valued because each one helps us improve our content and give our viewers a fresh viewpoint. We all try to understand life by sharing our experiences with one another. And this video was just one example of how we try to connect with others through storytelling, learning about different sides of life. What we saw today was only a small part of the many stories shared on Reddit and around the world. If you haven't already, please like and follow for more incredible content. Your support keeps us going, and we will work to bring you more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for your time. And don't forget to keep an eye out for more stories coming soon. We hope to continue sharing stories like these that help us all learn and grow together. Be careful and continue to be curious. Until the next time, **.